First of our kinesthetic learning exercises today, we're going to be looking at the musculature in the anterior portion of the Antebrachium. You'll notice that we have three separate diagrams up here, and that's because the musculature is quite extensive and is typically divided into superficial, intermediate, and deep groups. We'll be starting with the superficial group, which have a general common origin off of the medial epicondyle of the humerus. We know this as the common flexor tendon. First in this group is a muscle called Flexor, Carpi, Ulnaris. The muscle is going to project down from the common flexor tendon and is going to have several attachment points, one to the pisiform, another one to the hamate, and then to the base of the fifth metacarpal, and provides the muscular mass that we find on the medial aspect of the arm. The name tells you everything you need to know about its function. Carpi means wrist, so this is a flexor of the wrist, and to distinguish it from some of the other flexors, it's found on the ulnar side, hence the term ulnaris. Next muscle to look at is Palmaris Longus. This one's actually a little bit of an anomaly in that it doesn't insert onto a bone at all. It will actually insert into the fascial covering, the palmar fascia, on the palmar surface of the hand. So once again, it has a origin off of the common flexor tendon, and then we'll come down a little bit more medial compared to what we saw with the flexor carpi ulnaris, and then as I said, it will run to the palmar fascia superficially in the hand. What's also interesting about it is it's considered a vestigial muscle, meaning that not everyone has it. And there's a little trick that can be shown in lab to see if you can make the tendon stand out to verify whether you have one or not. The third muscle to look at is your flexor carpi radialis. Not too unexpected that we would see this muscle since we've already looked at flexor carpi ulnaris. So once again, this is going to be a flexor of the wrist specifically. It's attaching to the carpal bones. In this case, it is going to attach to the base of the second and the third carpal bones, and has its origin again off of that common flexor tendon. So runs very, very close to the tendon for Palmaris longus if present. And again, the name of the muscle tells you its function. It's a flexor of the wrist, and this is the one that's seen on the lateral radial aspect as compared to the flexor carpi ulnaris, which we already identified. And we're going to find this as a general theme as we're naming these forearm musculature, that their name is based on their function, and a distinction if we have muscles with more than one function, then the additional parts of the name are to allow us to distinguish these different aspects. Last muscle to look at is Pronator T Ruiz. So once again, we're seeing a muscle that's named based on its function, and in this case, the T Ruiz means round because we're going to find there's two of them, and this is the rounder of the two. Origin's a little bit further up on the common flexor tendon, so a little bit away, and this one is actually going to run quite laterally at an oblique angle to insert mid-shaft on the radius. So as a result, when this muscle contracts, it's going to cause pronation. It's going to fold the radius over top of the ulna. That brings us to the intermediate group. Only one muscle to look at in the intermediate group, and that is Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. This has quite an extensive origin. A little bit comes off of the inferior portion of the common flexor tendon, but then it also has an attachment off of the ulna and a little bit larger attachment related to the radius. And so anatomists describe these as being the humeral ulnar head, radial head, to distinguish them. Incidentally, Pronator T Ruiz also has a small origin off of the ulna as well, so we also talk about the humeral head and the ulnar head of the Pronator T Ruiz, and that becomes important because the median nerve will run between the two. Connect these up, and what we'll find is this muscle belly will actually generate 4 separate tendons, each going to the 2nd through 5th digits in the hand. Now, when they travel through what we're going to learn as the carpal tunnel, they travel through the superficial surface, which is a fairly narrow space, so to be able to pass through, rather than going side by side, they bunch up into a 4-pack arrangement. And from there, after they pass through the carpal tunnel, they once again branch out so that the index and middle finger will travel to their respective targets, and the ring and little finger will do the same. One final note, and we'll elaborate on this a little bit further when we get to the discussion in the hand of the long tendons, but when it gets to the middle phalanx in each of these cases, it will actually split and will attach on either side of the palmar aspect of the middle phalanx. So still attaches anteriorly, but it does this splitting. And we'll see why that's important in just a moment. That'll take us to the deep group. First muscle to look at in the deep group is the Flexor Digitorum Profundus. So again, looking at these last 2 muscles, Flexor Digitorum Superficialis, flexor of the digits lying superficially, Flexor Digitorum Profundus, flexor of the digits lying deep. Profound means deep. When we look at the origin point for the Flexor Digitorum Profundus, it has a fairly extensive origin off of the ulna and the medial aspect of the interosseous membrane, and then once again it's going to produce 4 separate tendons. But in this case it lies deeper in the carpal tunnel, which is a wider space, so we don't have to have that bunching arrangement. These will actually travel side by side through the carpal tunnel, and they extend all the way down to the distal phalanx in this situation, so they attach on the very end. You compare that to Flexor Digitorum Superficialis, it actually only flexes the proximal interphalangeal joint. This actually flexes all the way to the distal interphalangeal joint. So jumping back to the first diagram for a minute, looking at Flexor Digitorum Superficialis, we talked about the splitting of the tendon. So what we actually see is because this lies on top, it splits and attaches early, and then the Flexor Digitorum below will actually emerge from that split to attach to its distal target. Note that I'm not drawing in the secondary muscle for the intermediate compartment. I'm just showing the arrangement for the Flexor Digitorum Profundus tendons as compared to Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. Next, we have our Flexor Palmaris Longus. So again, the name tells you it is a flexor of the pollex, which is the term for thumb. Longus means that there's going to be a brevis, but we won't see that until we look at the intrinsic hand muscles. This will sit right beside Flexor Digitorum Profundus, very deep in this anterior compartment, and this one lies on the lateral aspect of the interosseous membrane as well as the radius. And it only has a single tendon coming off, which also travels through the carpal tunnel and then runs to the distal phalanx of the thumb. So it's going to flex both the metacarpal phalangeal joint and the interphalangeal joint that we see with the thumb. One last muscle to throw in, and unfortunately I probably should have put this one in first. Hindsight's 2020. You can either fit it in yourself or you can do a different diagram for this, but I'm just going to remove those tendons for a minute to give a better view of it. And this is your Pronator Quadratus. So we had the Pronator T Ruiz earlier. That was the round pronator. Pronator Quadratus, as the name implies, it tends to be more of a square pronator. So that's why we decided on these names to distinguish them. Square-shaped muscle, as the name implies, lying quite distally on the radius and ulna. And the fibers essentially run in a very transverse sort of orientation. So again, it's able to pull the radius over top of the ulna. And we'll just finish this off by drawing the tendons that we took out back in. Now going to look at the posterior muscular compartment. As with the anterior compartment, it can be divided up into, in this case, two separate groups, superficial and deep musculature of the posterior Antebrachium, hence the two diagrams. When looking at the posterior compartment, a number of the muscles, especially in the superficial group, come off the lateral epicondyle, as well as a region just above it known as the supracondylar ridge. First one that we'll identify is known as Brachioradialis. This does come off the supracondylar ridge, and it doesn't cross the wrist joint, but it does extend down and attach on the medial and also into the anterior, to a certain degree, aspect of the radius. So this is one that really stands out when you try and cock your arm in a neutral position, try and flex at the elbow in a neutral position. It stands out on the side of your forearm. Next muscle down from that, a little bit further down on the supracondylar ridge, is your Extensor Carpi Radialis Longus muscle. And this is going to attach to the base of the second metacarpal bone. So this one will cross at the wrist. Next, coming off just a little bit further down on the common extensor tendon itself, is the Extensor Carpi Radialis Brevis muscle. And this is going to have its insertion point very close to the longus, a little bit further on the third metacarpal bone. Next muscle is your Extensor Digitorum. Notice that we only have a single Extensor Digitorum, so we don't need to name it Superficialis or Profundus or Longus or Brevis or anything like that. The Extensor Digitorum, once again, comes off of the common extensor tendon area, and in this case it is going to project down and attach on the distal digits 2 through 5 on the posterior surface. And in doing so, it creates a rather extensive tendon in this area for each of the fingers that we know as the extensor hood. So there's Extensor Digitorum. Lateral to Extensor Digitorum, so we had these four tendons going to each of these different digits. There is a small muscle associated with Extensor Digitorum which sends an additional tendon down to the smallest finger, and so we call this Extensor Digiti Minimi. Digiti Minimi being an expression that we use for that pinky finger. The last muscle of the superficial group that we need to draw in is the Extensor Carpi Ulnaris muscle. I drew the last couple a little bit further laterally or medially than I should. The Extensor Carpi Ulnaris will actually attach to the base of the fifth metacarpal, and so once again we see it coming off of the common extensor tendon and then running down the tendon attaching to the base of that fifth metacarpal. We now move into the deep portion of the posterior compartment. These muscles are typically called the outcropping muscles because of the fact that they project out from underneath the superficial group to attach to the thumb. First one we're going to identify is the abductor Palmaris Longus. Comes off both the radius and ulna, and a portion off of it off of the intramembranous ligament, and it's going to insert at the base of the first metacarpal bone. And as the name implies, it's going to assist with abduction of the thumb. Second muscle to look at is the extensor pollicis brevis muscle. It originates a bit further down from the Palmaris Longus, off of the ulna radius, as well as a portion of it from the intramembranous membrane or intramembranous ligament. And in this case, it's going to project down to attach to the base of the proximal phalanx of the thumb. Third muscle is extensor Palmaris Longus. Comes off a little bit further up, hence the name. It's slightly larger, a little bit off of the ulna in addition to the intramembranous ligament. And in this case, the fibers, they tend to project down a little more straight at first, and then we actually see the tendon strike out, and it will run to the base of the distal phalange. So when you first look at it in the body, you have a very small relative view just at the wrist region, and it kind of looks that it's coming in at a sharper angle, so it's a little deceptive that it is a longus, but it does in fact take a much longer route to be able to get to its target. Last muscle to talk about is known as the Extensor Indices muscle. As the name implies, this is going to be an extensor of the index finger. It actually lies deep to the extensor pollicis longus as it runs to meet the thumb, but from there the fibers will extend out to the base of the distal phalange in the second digit or index finger. But just remember that it actually lies deep to extensor pollicis longus. So to finish drawing this in, we'll just redraw the boundaries of pollicis longus to give that impression. Second kinesthetic learning exercise, we'll look at the nerves supplying the anterior and posterior antebrachium, as well as those that continue into the hand. Start with, we will continue the path for the median nerve. So this is the one that we last picked up running medial to the brachial artery. As it continues past the elbow, it will give off a few branches to the superficial muscles in the anterior compartment. It then continues down, where it will give off some additional branches to the deep muscles in the anterior compartment, and that includes Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. This will then pass through the carpal tunnel, which we'll be talking about next time, curve around, and supply muscles within the thenar eminence, which is the fleshy portion at the base of your thumb. So it's primarily for the anterior compartment, but also some muscles within the hand. The ulnar nerve we last saw passing posterior to the medial epicondyle in that funny bone region. This is going to continue along the medial aspect of the forearm, at which point it does give off a small number of muscular branches, and then continues into the hand, where it will supply the overwhelming majority of muscles into the hand itself. So as a general rule, the median nerve does most of the anterior forearm, whereas the ulnar nerve is going to do most of the hand musculature. Now look at the continuation of the radial nerve into the posterior compartment of the antebrachium. So this is the nerve that traveled through the spiral groove, emerged, and actually ran anterior, just slightly, to the lateral epicondyle before running back posteriorly and diving deep into the posterior compartment. At this point, it's going to give off a couple of individual branches, one of which will give off branches to the superficial musculature in the posterior compartment, and the other which runs a little bit more inferiorly and gives off a number of branches to the deep muscles, the outcropping muscles within the posterior compartment. In addition to these, there is a single additional branch which stays more lateral to anterior, which comes off just distal to the medial epicondyle. This one provides no muscular branches whatsoever, but it does continue into the base of the hand to provide cutaneous innervation to the region around the thumb, as well as to the lateral dorsal aspect of the hand. So important to note here, though, that when we look at this particular branch that runs deep in the posterior compartment, this is a muscular branch, so it's all motor innervation. Whereas this superficial running branch that we see continuing more laterally is completely cutaneous. There are no intrinsic muscles of the dorsum of the hand as we are going to identify, so this is 100% cutaneous innervation.